You know, I'm an old and grizzled veteran of the language learning world, and you can tell from my beard. Now, my life as a language learner really started with middle school German, which was so ugly that I'm not even going to talk about it. I eventually learned German the right way in the LDS Church's Missionary Training Center. I then learned Chinese, starting with my time in Germany, and then continued with classes at Brigham Young University. Years after that, I had the extremely rare opportunity to learn Korean at the Foreign Service Institute. And at some point in time, I used one of those really crappy teach yourself programs to try to learn French on my own. So I've been through my share of ups and downs through all of these adventures. There are always lessons you can learn from these experiences, both positive and negative. And today I'll tell you a little bit of the story of what it was like for me to learn Korean at the Foreign Service Institute, which happened a long time ago, started 16 years ago. Be warned though that this story is going to probably surprise you a little bit. Now, if you've been in the world of learning languages on your own for a while, you're probably familiar with the old Foreign Service Institute textbook series. Now, most of the old FSI textbooks were made in the 1970s and 80s, though these languages, of course, haven't actually changed that much in the last 50 years. Now, the nice thing is that you can find digitized copies of the old audio tapes, which means that you will have native speaker audio to listen to. And the textbooks really aren't horrible, provided that you're willing to put up with the parts that are handwritten. Now, I think that all of those textbooks are in the public domain, which is why you can find them on so many different websites. And if they're not, there's a lot of piracy out there, I guess. Anyway, it's not really a bad way to learn if you're a beginner, though you really should be combining it with a program like Anki and with talking with actual native speakers. I'm talking about like going out and getting a professional native speaking tutor if you really want to make progress. But you also need to know that the Foreign Service Institute does not use those old FSI textbooks anymore. When I started learning Korean way back in 2010, FSI had largely switched over to more professional and academic resources. But let's start at the beginning. I joined the United States Foreign Service back in the summer of 2010. Now, in case you don't know, there's this event that they call Flag Day, where new diplomats first learn which posts they've been assigned to begin with. It happens something like a month and a half into the process, and it dictates what you will do for the first couple of years in your new job. So it's kind of a big deal. And that Flag Day and those early bidding decisions, those also dictate whether you're going to spend time learning a language or not. But I'll get a little bit deeper into that strange world of language learning and the State Department bidding system in a couple of minutes. The story here is that I managed to get myself assigned to learn a new language, Korean, despite coming into the State Department with fluency in 2 different foreign languages. Now, as you can imagine, most Foreign Service new hires who speak Chinese wind up going to China in the beginning of their careers, usually to do visa work. I was fortunate, however, that my initial bid list included a position in Shenyang, China, which listed Korean as an optional secondary language. Northeast China has a pretty large ethnic Korean population, and Shenyang just so happens to be the focal point of a lot of Korean commerce, both from South Korea and from North Korea. And yeah, I do have a lot of stories from my time there, some of which I can actually tell you. Now, most people didn't want to go to Shenyang since it's kind of isolated. It's up in northeast China, right? It's really cold up there. There are a lot of Foreign Service officers who think that it's a backward post. It's had this like kind of weird sort of legacy that's lasted for decades and decades, and it can never really shake that reputation. But I was happy to go there, and so I found myself assigned to Shenyang, along with an assignment to learn as much Korean as I could beforehand. So as you language geeks already know, Korean is listed as one of the hardest languages for English speakers to learn. The State Department estimates that it takes about 88 weeks to learn the language to an acceptable level, though personally I think this estimate is totally meaningless. Korean uses a different alphabet and has a completely different grammatical structure, which means it's a lot harder than learning something like Swedish if your native language is English. But the truth is that it takes a lot more than just a certain number of weeks to actually master a language. So what I'm getting at here is that the Foreign Service approach to language learning is completely bureaucratic, and for some of us it's actually depressingly bureaucratic, right? Like, it's the sort of bureaucratic thing where you will do this thing because we tell you to, and you get this amount of time to do it because the system tells you you have this amount of time to do it. So when it comes to how much time you need to learn a certain foreign language, this is all something that was decided years and years ago, probably back in the 1950s, right? Somebody said at one point in time it takes this amount amount of time, and therefore it takes this amount of time, and we're always right, and you cannot question it. And so as a result, the teachers are instructed to teach the Foreign Service officers to do this task or to do that task because that's what they're supposed to do, right? Whether it makes sense or not for students to learn this is another question. Now, the problem is that all of this is completely incompatible with that general sense of exploration and mystery and discovery that normally comes with foreign language learning. The Foreign Service language learning process is focused around language tests, which are on a 0 to 5 scale. So this is a 0 to 5 scale, with 0 meaning that you can't speak a single word and 5 meaning that you are functionally equivalent to a native speaker. This is all a product of the 1950s, and it's a pretty straightforward approach to the problem of language proficiency. The thing is, when you go to the Foreign Service Institute, the actual goal is a bureaucratic goal. They want you to test out at as high a level as possible, but at least to test out at the minimum level that they set up for you before going to post. So I was going to China. If I were going to Korea for my first tour and they were teaching me Korean, I would likely need to hit the 2-2 level of the language. Most people I knew who went to China hit the 2-2 level of Chinese, and so they were given a certain amount of the language that was commensurate with this idea that they would hit the 2-2 level. Now, the funny thing about all of this is, especially in Korean or smaller languages, the people who test you are the same people who teach you, right? So my favorite Korean teacher during my time there actually tested me twice in Korean, and you can imagine that I wasn't all that thrilled with the relatively low scores that I've received from her, but hey, I guess I got what I deserved. But what you need to realize is that the test itself is really the focus of the language instruction. It's not there to help you actually get immersed in the language. For example, we used Integrated Korean as our basic Korean textbook for the first few months. However, we never really made it through the intermediate 2 level. In fact, when I finally arrived in Shenyang, I bought and studied the more advanced books on my own in hopes of taking myself to a higher level of proficiency. Now, the thing about language learning that nobody wants to admit is that you really have to put in the time and effort yourself to effectively learn the language. There's no program anywhere in the world that will actually do this work for you. You've got to be motivated to study the language on your own, in your own time, and you really are only going to get as much out of the language as you put into it. And sadly, in the Foreign Service lifestyle, there are actually a couple of factors that sort of disincentivize you from taking that extra time to learn the language at a higher level. And one of these is the Foreign Service bidding system, which I will try to explain briefly. When you first get into the Foreign Service, the bidding process is handled entirely by your Career Development Officers, the CDOs, which is a fancy way of saying HR. The HR officers decide who winds up going where, who learns languages, and who stays in DC, and my thanks to all the random people who put these great photos up online, since I didn't take any photos in the early stages of my career. Now, when you advance to the mid-level of the Foreign Service career, bidding on jobs turns into something that you are now personally responsible for. You literally have to apply for positions and lobby for support from senior people you've met along the way. It's sort of like you're applying for a brand new job every couple of years. Now, I'm dead serious about this, right? Bidding is one of the great nightmares of the Foreign Service. It's an awful system. It rewards people who have these nepotistic relationships, and it's a headache for the vast majority of Foreign Service officers, especially people whose, lives and children rely on successfully navigating the bidding system. So the sad truth is that people who get into the right in crowd for whatever reason, maybe they had an impressive resume and, the ambassador at Post said, hey, look, this guy was a former professor before he joined the Foreign Service. We want him to go serve in the front office, and then he's going to go meet everybody and get his career set up for himself, right? These people tend to have the easy time since they get friends, and the friends will take them wherever it is they want to go. Those of us who are mere mortals and who end up doing some of the grunt work will wind up spending hours and hours in interviews and sending off emails as part of the bidding process, only to discover that the hiring managers actually made the decisions months ago, long long before we ever got the job, right? Which sounds like what? That sounds like the way that you apply for a job in the real world. Anyway, when you consider that this is all part of the Foreign Service and the State Department bureaucracy, what you realize is that this is a hilariously broken system that no other country in the world uses. The result of the system, of course, is a bunch of Foreign Service officers who have bizarre career trajectories and experiences and who end up not really knowing much about whatever country it is that they're serving in. So, for example, some of the people I worked with in China didn't serve in China again for years or even decades. They would wind up going to some place like Brazil for their second tour. Maybe they would end up in India for their third tour. And then perhaps they'd wind up in, I don't know, like Vietnam for their fourth tour. Now, this might make sense if you're talking about people who did not have like Chinese experience before they entered the State Department, right? But when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about people I knew who had experience working in China and studying Chinese before state, right? These are the people who were hired by the State Department because of their Chinese experience. They didn't want to go back to China, and so they set up a deliberate bidding strategy that was designed to indefinitely delay their return to China. Now, technically, there are rules against this, right? If you take language points before going in, you're supposed to serve in that country at the entry level and at the mid level at some point in time. Nobody really checks up on you, right? There's not really a mechanism in place to make sure that this happens. Also, you're technically supposed to take any assignment you're given per the needs of the service, but the truth is that most assignments at the mid-level are not given to you. Instead, you navigate this awful and broken system to try to get them yourself. Because that way, when you feel disgruntled at your post, you're told that, well, you're the one who decided to come here, you can't feel bad about it, right? The truth is that the Foreign Service does a particularly poor job of taking people with certain abilities and putting them in the place where they fit the best. Rather, it does a very good job of rewarding people who, through nepotistic means, wind up getting the nice posts, and then it lets everybody else go wherever. The other problem you've got is that most jobs on mid-level bid lists assume that you will learn the language before you arrive at post. So when you're looking at a bid list, you see what they call a TED, which means the estimated date that you will arrive at post. Now, if you're looking at a post like China where you're expected to learn Chinese, the TED will include 2 years of Chinese language study built in with this assumption that you will need to learn the language first. And so if you want to go to China, but you already have the language, you have to find another post to fill in those 2 years since you won't get language study time. And the thing is, you can't exactly tell them that you want to like top off or you want to get your language score at a higher level. So if you've already got like a 3.3 score at whatever language it is, they're not going to let you learn more of the language at FSI to use up that time before you go to post. It'd be really nice if they did, and it probably would be helpful for American diplomacy, but the system is not designed to work like that, right? The general idea is that your language is good enough for the job that you're doing, and if your language meets the requirement that was arbitrarily set for the job, that's all you're going to get. So if I have like a 4.4 in Chinese and I'm applying for a job with a 3.3 and there's a little bit of time in between, I can't say, let me go to FSI and, intensely study Confucianism or Dream of the Red Chamber or something like this to get to the 5.5 level. Like, that might be helpful, but the bureaucracy is not set up to be like that. You already have this prerequisite level, so you kind of have to take what you have and kind of use it, right? Now, this is pretty problematic, especially if you take a step back, which Foreign Service officers generally do not do. But if you take that step back and you look at why it is that we study languages in the first place, you'll see the problem. While the job certainly is about going to exotic and unusual places, the truth is that it's more about communication than anything else. Regardless of what your job is, a big part of it will be to make personal connections with contacts in country, which means that you do need to learn how to speak their language. In fact, authentic language communication is one of the most essential parts of diplomacy. As former Ambassador Chas Freeman once said, it's the language to the soul. Now, this is actually pretty politically relevant today. Now, I don't want to turn this into like a political video. I don't want people watching this to feel upset because they support one political party or ideology over another, right? This isn't the right place for that. But the truth, though, is that you really want your diplomats to learn authentic and culturally appropriate ways to communicate. The reason why is because you're here to facilitate meaningful cross-cultural communication. So, in other words, to put this really simply, like, you can't just go walk the walk, which is what diplomats learn how to do really early on. you really need to know how to talk the talk. Sometimes that means going and meeting with government officials. Sometimes it means being able to talk to like the farmer who went to the visa interview for some reason or other and who probably is, about to be trafficked to the United States if you give him the visa. Ambassador Freeman's book is called The Diplomat's Dictionary and is filled with all sorts of relevant quotations and nuggets. For example, you're not supposed to just learn language to know the language. You're supposed to learn it so you can effectively communicate, and of course, communication is a two-way street. And, at least in Ambassador Freeman's opinion, this extends to what he calls the language that is most common between educated men, which means you need to know a thing or two about like fine arts, high culture, philosophy, and so on. There's also this quotation from Harold Nicholson about how the worst kind of diplomats are the fanatics, the lawyers, and the missionaries. Now, the reason for this is pretty simple. So if you're a diplomat, your job is not just to go present your country's message to people in the host country. You also need to understand what they are saying to you, to understand it in the context of, living in the country and dealing with things the way that they're set up in that country. You need to take this message and relay it back to your host country. That's what this whole world of diplomatic cables is theoretically supposed to be about. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. Instead, what usually happens is it's kind of like a political talk where there are certain things we do and don't talk about depending on how the political winds are blowing in Washington, right? The thing is, you're supposed to be able to do this reporting in a culturally and a politically appropriate way, but this can become very difficult when your administration is hell-bent on replacing all the professional diplomats with zealots and missionaries. In other words, your job is not only to learn the language so you can deliver your message to important contacts in the foreign country. You also need to be humble enough to listen to what the other side has to say and relay their message and opinion to your own government, even if it's not what your government wants to hear. And if history has taught us anything, it's that those experienced diplomats who are stationed abroad have a much better perspective on what really happens in that country than the journalists who are at home. Or in other words, if you're running the government and your approach to foreign policy is to fire all the diplomats and use AI chatbots instead, hint, hint, you're not going to last very long. It's not going to cut it. The problem is that this level of nuance and understanding really requires diplomats to have extensive contacts in foreign countries and to actually live there long enough to acquire this level of expertise. Now, in reality, the United States Foreign Service is not designed to do this. As I described to you, the truth is that the Foreign Service Institute is really only equipped to get you up to the 3 level. Anything beyond that is really your personal responsibility. And it can be very difficult to set things up so you serve consecutive tours in the same country, though it is possible if you use at least a little bit of gamesmanship. Generally, you will not be able to stay in the same country indefinitely unless you're in a place like China where there are always more jobs than interested bidders. There are also requirements that come with the Foreign Service lifestyle, such as home leave, where you are forced to return to the United States periodically, specifically to prevent you from becoming too familiar with the foreign country. So the long-term effect of all of these policies has been to create a United States diplomatic corps of foreign service officers that are more a jack of all trades than an actual master of a specific country or language or culture, right? This is why they call the traditional foreign service officers generalists, right? You think, well, I'll be a specialist instead, and then you realize that your speciality is going to be being the IT guy, right? And they won't teach you any language or anything about the local culture, right? Now, if you're a generalist, the idea is that you can do a whole ton of different generalist things at a general, acceptable level of competence, rather than being a specific expert in one field or another. And so all diplomats will know, if you're in the United States Foreign Service, you will always know how to process a visa, how to process a passport, how to send a cable back home, right? How to do sort of these basic bureaucratic things, how to handle your own travel orders, and all the other nonsense you're supposed to do. But when it comes to diplomatic communication, this turns into a major problem. Now, if you want to serve effectively in a country like China with its cultural emphasis on interpersonal relations, you really need to take the time to build up your contacts. And if you really want to be taken seriously, you need to have the time and the encouragement to develop your abilities to understand and communicate directly within the local culture. As many of you know, you will not develop a taste for what Ambassador Freeman called the language of educated men in China unless you spend a lot of time and effort devoted to that task. Anyway, the result of all of this is that you get a bunch of Foreign Service officers who serve temporarily at their post, almost like they are bands of traveling salesmen. Now, that should sound familiar to you if you remember my video on learning language as a Mormon missionary. You're going to have a really hard time as a diplomat making a significant personal connection with anybody if you're only there temporarily, and your ability to, truly master the language or really learn the culture will be stunted by the lack of any real incentives to learn. And in all honesty, I really do see this as the biggest weakness in modern American diplomacy. Now, that's not to say that the Korean instructors I had at the Foreign Service Institute were bad. On the contrary, I thought that they were excellent. Some of them were among the best teachers I have ever had, and I really learned quite a bit of Korean in the mere 30 weeks that the system gave me. Unfortunately, though, a lot of the work that we did was focused around giving us huge data dumps of word lists, and this was all in hopes that we could miraculously learn all of this stuff in just a few days. Anyway, that really has got to be the biggest shame of all. So seriously, if you want to learn any language the right way, you've got to give yourself some time. You've got to get yourself immersed in the culture of the language. You need to be exposing yourself to the language constantly. You should not be cramming things into your mind over and over again because the government says you need to be able to do X, Y, and Z in this certain amount of time. Now, as for the Foreign Service, well, as much fun as it was to serve in the Foreign Service, I can honestly say that my life has been much better since I left the Foreign Service. And to be really blunt with you, in that sense, it's a little bit like religion. When you're in, you feel like this is your world and your life and you can never imagine anything outside of it. But then when you get out, you look back and you realize that this thing that seemed so wonderful at the time was actually holding you back all along.